You know what I've never done? Made a big old sign for the front of a church. Stand by. Hey everybody, welcome back to RATTLECAN Fab Shop. I am James. If you are looking for the square format Insta snap your face version of this, I'll put a link up here in the corner. This is going to be the somewhat exhaustive. We're going to talk about everything that goes into building a sign like this, from the initial concept all the way to installation. So the original inspiration for this actually came from a previous project, which was actually inspired by a small 2-inch square decal of the new logo for this church, which, just as a skill exercise, I turned into I don't know what you want to call it, industrial wall decor. And from that, a conversation quickly started along the lines of, do you think you can build us a sign? And, well, of course, the answer is, yeah, let's give it a shot. So we had some meetings and some discussions, and I threw out some sketches, and the next thing you know, we've got a design plan. And that plan had to take into account that we had to work with this existing base. This was from the previous occupants. This building actually used to be a car dealership, and so we imagine there would have been a pretty large pedestal sign here. So we have a aluminum clad concrete and steel channel base. It's 4 feet tall, it's 8 feet long, it's a foot wide, and as you can see, it has some mighty large bolts in there that we're going to incorporate into the design. So we came up with this idea for a frame, a 4 foot tall by 8 foot long by 1 foot wide frame. We're going to make that out of 2-inch square tubing. The outside of that frame would be covered in steel, 16 gauge cold rolled steel, and we would have the logo and the text in the proportions and the font that they wanted. We would have those cut out, and then they would be backed with acrylic, and they would be lit from the inside with weatherproof dual row LEDs, so that they would give off a nice white glow. So we sketched all of this up. We had a couple of revision meetings, and then we sent it off to the planning commission for the city. And after a very, very short period of time, they came back with a yes. And then we were off to the races to start ordering materials and begin fabrication. So once our materials started arriving, it just becomes another fab project, and it's the same steps. You got to clean your material. You gotta prep your material for what you're getting ready to do to it. In my case, I had one additional task, and I had to convert my MIG welder over into a flux core welder. There's a video on that if you want to take a gander. Once that was completed, we were able to use our assortment of squares from Fireball Tools to utilize our floor as a welding table. I don't have a 4 by 8 foot welding table, so we were able to make sure that our frame sides were not only square but also coplanar, and then we could start the welding process, which, if you've got bad knees, can be somewhat of a challenge, and you basically just put yourself in uncomfortable situations and weld. I mean, that's what you do, right? So you make a bunch of welds, and then you clean a bunch of welds, and then you make a bunch more welds, and it's just, rinse and repeat until you get it done. Here I'm putting the supports that are going to space those two big pieces of the frame out, and then we started laying out where we were going to put our holes to put our inserts in to hold the skin on. So what I decided to go with is something called a Riv-nut. It's kind of like a threaded insert that we use in bolt-on neck guitars, but in this case it's applied almost like a pop rivet with that sort of tool. We'll show you that in a minute, but that allows us to put a threaded insert into the steel tubing, and then we're able to affixate this outer skin where we want it to go, and then we can also go for a coordinating look between the frame and the hardware holding the skin onto it, and that's just a black oxide coated cap head, or not a cap head, button head screw, and just a washer on that. And that way, if we have to take those panels off for maintenance later on, it's easy peasy. Now, I am in possession of a couple of 300-pound gorillas, one of them being myself, and through a little bit of experimentation, you can twist these out if you lean into her hard enough. So just as an added measure of security, I went in and just put a couple of real quick TIG tacks in there just to make sure that we don't spin one of those out when we're all excited getting it installed. And then we just continue the process of locating where those holes are, drilling through the outer skin as well as the inner tubing, so that we make sure that all of our holes are lined up correctly. And here's that Riv-nut tool that you thread down on there, and you give it the good squeezy squeeze, and then it deforms the back of that insert that you're putting in there, and it pulls it up tight against the inside of that frame. They're pretty nifty. And then after I put the tack in, I run a tap down in there and clean up those threads. Then we'll install our hardware, make sure all of our holes are lined up, and then we'll stand her up and take a look. So here we're just looking at the fit and finish. Do the panels line up straight? Are they in line with the edges? Is the reveal consistent, from one side to the other side? The lower, this is the lower template that I made because I have to figure out where I can place my two bottom braces, and you can see I've got some big, I guess cleats is a term for it. I've got a hole with electrical coming out of it, and I wanted to make sure that I put those in just the right spot so they also sit on that big chunk of C channel. And here you get them welded in. And we cut a couple of notches in because I've got two cylinder locks on the back panel, so that way if you need access to the light board, you just undo the bolts, unlock it, pull it out. A project like this is great for getting you out of the habit, if you're just trying to learn how to weld, of just running bead after bead after bead on a plate, because a project like this, you weld in every position, even the really uncomfortable ones, and those are the ones you really need practice on anyways. So now we're drilling attachment holes so those big bolts can go through with this big carbide tipped hole saw, and then stitch welds on that big piece of 11 gauge. Swapping from side to side. I'm trying to manage how much heat I'm dumping into this. And on top of that, it's just kind of a nice welding shot. Now let's talk a little bit about this light board that we've got in this frame. It rides on a little piece of channel steel, and it's just a sheet of 18 gauge with some 1/2 inch stiffeners on either end. And here I'm trying to figure out where to put some guides, because you're going to slide this in and out when you're wanting to do any sort of maintenance. And then we're also cutting the channel according to our design plan, and this is what our LEDs are going to adhere themselves to. And then we will cover them with these diffuser covers here, so you don't see the individual LEDs coming through the holes. Marked all the holes, punched all the holes, drilled all the holes, chamfered all the holes. So we laid everything out on our light board, marked all the holes, punched all the holes, and then we just use those self-tapping number 6 screws to attach them on there. And I looked at that 50 times, and it agreed with what was on the paper, but it still didn't look right. So you'll see, we end up doing a revision a little bit later on, but you can see we're offset by probably just about a 1/2 inch from one side to the other side. And then there's the electronics are just kind of mocked up. So then we had to go through and we had to cut our LED strips. You'll notice my very fashionable Hello Kitty headband, because it is just hot as day. And here's everything mocked up. Our links are cut, so that way we can take them to the bench and start getting things prepped for solder. So soldering these up isn't too difficult. You just have to figure out the right process. Again, these are the weatherproof, weather resistant, whatever term you want to use, and they are coated with a layer of silicone. And so you have got to cut that off of there to expose the pads. These are going to they're going to give you cut lines. So some of them you can cut every inch, some of them you can cut every 3 inches, and they will tell you, it will indicate where you can make that cut at. But then you also, on these weatherproof ones, you have to get all of that silicone off of those little pads, so that you can put your little blob of the solder on there. Make sure you've tinned your connecting wires up as well. And then it's just fairly straightforward after that, if you can keep the wire where it's supposed to be. Then this is a look at the first of many coats of, we've decided to go with a cold blue process on this frame. Whether it's the right choice or not in the long run, we'll find out. But lots of cleaning, and then applying of the blue and then wiping it back off. And then these are the guides that we talked about earlier, 1/2 inch angle, so that way you can slide this in and out and it keeps it centered in the frame as well. And then the process of getting all of these LED strips affixated into the channels. And as you can see, it's hot as again, even with the fan blowing on us. I personally am not 100% trustworthy of just the tape on these, especially since this is going to be outside. This is going to be a pretty warm situation, so these strips go into the channels with the adhesive on the back. Shut up, cat. And then we will silicone the ends of those, and then we will put that frosted plastic cover on top of that, and that will keep everything sealed up fairly well. Don't forget a grommet for your wire in case you're running through a panel like that. You don't want to have any kind of movement, like, if you're in a windy location, there's a possibility this thing can shake back and forth a little bit. And if it does that enough and you don't have protection on that wire, it will eat through that wire and you will have a problem. Now we've got everything in there, we're going to use these little anchors and some zip ties, making sure to clip the end of the zip ties off, and then with our DC power supply, I'm going to do a little testing. I'm going to make sure everything flashes, make sure everything is working the way it's supposed to be, making sure we don't have any dead LEDs in the middle of our strips. And this is just a finish test. It's just a whole bunch of different grits of sandpaper. Some of it is on a random orbit sander, some of it's on a belt sander, some of it's not even done at all. We're just doing a test. So now we're gonna fabricate up a couple of test pieces because we have to make some brackets that are going to retain our plexiglass on the back of those big steel sheets. And so I'm just going to try to use some 1/4 inch aluminum bar. And I've got 2 pieces. And then every one of these, we're going to drill a hole through it, and then we're going to tap it. And then we're going to make a little, I don't know what you call it, a retention bar. Everything's got to be sanded down because you don't want anybody scratching themselves. And you drill a hole in one end of that, and then you're going to give that a little bit of a bend on the end so that you'll be able to put some pressure on. So here we are mocking it up. Again, just a 1/4 20 cap head bolt. And yay, it works. So let's make a whole bunch of them. We have to retain the small piece of plexiglass that goes behind the 3-bar F, and then there's that large piece of plexiglass that goes behind the text. And there's 2 lines of text. There's the larger one that says Fearless, and then there's the one below that that says Church. And so that's just covered by one big piece of plexi. So there's a little bit of weight there that we need to support. Now, to support that piece of plexiglass on the bottom of that large piece, I've actually got a piece of aluminum angle, and I've scuffed one side of it up, and I have scuffed up the where it's going to be mounted on that piece of steel, and we're using good old JB Weld with those 2 surfaces as scuffed up like they are. And with the fact that this is is not going to be holding all of the weight of this piece of plexiglass on it, because we're also going to clamp it in a number of locations. So I've positioned it with some magnets, and then I have a piece of MDF on the other side of that steel, and what I'm just using are some thin strips of plywood and some screws with some big fender washers on it. Once those start to sink in to that MDF, it puts a good deal of pressure on that piece of angle, and it keeps it right where it needs to be, gives me enough pressure. Then I'm just double checking, making sure that we're all up. And you can see brackets on the top, cheapo clamps on the bottom. And this is what the other one is looking like. So while that is drying, we're going to go back over to the light board and we're going to start installing our diffusion covers. Make sure you load the end of that up with a big blob of silicone, just in case the weather gets in there. And then these channels, these covers fit very nicely into these channels. Now, on 3 of these runs, there is a seam because we only ordered them in 1 meter lengths, so you had to make sure you run a little film of some RTV over that seam. Now we got both sides of that done, and this bottom bracket has cured on this other piece. Now we can go about securing the retention brackets, those ones that we made. We are using the VHB tape on the back of those, and because we do want to put some pressure on that, so we get to kind of live out one of life's true axioms, which is the ideal number of clamps is the number of clamps that you have access to plus 1. Here I'm using regular, some people call them F clamps, some people call them bar clamps. Here we're using, some welding vice grips. That one closest to you, that's actually a Craig self-adjusting clamp. I've got some pony clamps. I've got some homemade, some homemade clamps that we've done there as well. You just use whatever you got to get the job done. So we decided on a 60 grit finish. It kind of knocks the shine down off of this, and it gives it just a little bit of a texture. And we're going to do that to all of the exterior panels. So of course we've got to get it all cleaned off as much as we can. And then you sit there and you do that for, I don't know, a couple of days. And now what we've got is got two things. One, we've got a test on mains power, on 120 power. Remember earlier where I told you something just didn't look quite right, even though it measured out right? Well, I figured out that I had a line wrong on my original drawing, and I trusted the line more than my own eye, and so I have some strips that are misaligned, so we are going to have to make an adjustment to that. And here we're just using some closed cell foam insulation tape on that back panel just to kind of keep the weather out. So here's me discussing with myself how I've had to change things. It looks much better now on the inside. Would you really have seen that difference from the outside? I don't know if you would have or not, but it bothered me enough to take the time to relocate all of those. And then here I'm just using a black RTV, and this is partly to try and keep the weather out. Again, we're never going to make this weatherproof. We're just trying to mitigate how much water we get coming in here. But more importantly, this is just to keep spurious light leaks, from getting a weird ray shooting out of the corner. We are next to a road, and you don't want to be blinding anybody. So we're finally to the point where we can put these drops back into the letters. And I just made some wooden spacers that were the size of that segment, and that way it just makes it easy to place it. We test the locks. The locks work fine. We put our final piece of plexiglass in, and then we make sure that it's adhered down, because we do have some VHB tape kind of holding I call them the floppy bits. They're not really floppy, but... And then it's installation day. Here we are back at that base that we started out with. Done some prep work. Got it kind of de-rustified a little bit. And then we found some rather brutish men to help me lift this up. The frame alone empty, as you see it right there, is 165 pounds. So it's not terribly heavy, but it's a 4x8 by 1 foot deep chunk of steel. So the Sparkies showed up. They got us wired, and super nice guys. Then as we got ready to lift the panels up, and then next thing you know, it's installed. It's starting to rain here. We got it in just in the nick of time. Some horrible rain for that weekend. But here's the electrical box. We've got a GFCI outlet in there. We have a switch for the light as well. And lo and behold, it actually comes on when the parking lot lights come on. It was a great build. I'm glad that they took a chance on a new guy like me to make this. I learned a lot from it. Can't wait to do something again. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. Have a good one. Cheers. I hope you found this episode educational or entertaining, or maybe even both. You might want to check this one out as well. Be sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell to be notified when new videos drop, and if you've got comments, make sure you put them down beneath the sermon notes. Thanks for hanging out with us here at the RATTLECAN Fab Shop. Y'all have a good one. Cheers.